They called her too much woman for a world made of drought and dust. Tall as any man, shoulders strong from lifting bales before she could read her name, she stood in the back of a creaking livestock wagon, arms roped like the animals beside her, eyes staring into nothing, or maybe something no one else could see. Her name was Maybeth. She was 17, though folks guessed older on account of the way she stood, unflinching, chin square, not bowed like most girls taught to fear the weight of their own presence. She didn't smile. Didn't scream either when they auctioned her for the price of a saddle mule. The sheriff muttered that she was a menace. One woman whispered she wasn't right in the head. But the truth was simpler than that. She'd just never been asked what she wanted. And now it was too late. The trader who won her bid said he didn't know what to do with her. Tried using her for freight labor, but said she spooked the other men, said she could lift a barrel by herself, and once tossed a rattlesnake into the fire without blinking. Called her giant girl, like it was something filthy. Then came the rancher. He rode in that morning with no hurry, coat dusted in trail salt, a tired horse and tired eyes. The kind of man the land either breaks or makes holy. Boone was his name. 50th a day. Kept mostly to his own land, which was spread quiet and dry across a basin no one had touched in years. Folks in town only knew him by the stories, about the wife that died birthing a boy who didn't last the night, about the brother who turned outlaw and never came home, about the long winters he spent alone building fences no one crossed. He hadn't come to buy anything that day. But when his eyes found Maybeth standing above the crowd, wrists tied and hair tangled like wind-wild rope, something shifted in him. Not pity. Boone wasn't the pitying kind. It was something deeper. Something like recognition. He paid in silence, not haggling, not asking where she came from, not asking if she'd been trouble. Just handed over coin and said 2 words. Unrope her. She didn't say thank you. Just stared. He turned his horse without waiting and said, "You coming or not?" And she did. They rode for a day and a half in silence, through the river bend where the cottonwoods leaned tired against the sky, past the dry gulch with bones half buried in sand. No one passed them. No birds flew above. Just wind and the sound of hooves, and the long empty whistle of a life neither of them had asked for. When they reached his ranch, he showed her the bunkhouse. 1 room, cedar walls, a bed that hadn't been used since '87. Said she could sleep there. Said he didn't care what she did, long as she didn't light fires in the dry months or let the gates hang open. She nodded. Next morning she was already up before the rooster. Fixed the barn door where the hinge had rotted out. Patched 2 fence posts. Drove the cattle in with a crooked stick and a whistle Boone hadn't heard in 10 years. All without being told. He watched from the porch, coffee in hand, unsure if he'd hired a girl or unearthed a ghost. Maybeth didn't talk. Not 'cause she couldn't, just 'cause the world hadn't earned her voice yet. One night, rain came sudden. One of those loud, messy storms that rolled out of the canyon like God was clearing his throat. Boone thought she'd hole up in the bunkhouse, but she didn't. He found her standing in the open, face tilted to the sky, hands loose at her sides. Rain hitting her like it had been looking for her all this time. And for the first time he didn't see a girl too big or strange or wild. He saw something that had been forged. Boone had lived long enough to know, the West didn't grow soft things. It only left what could survive. Days passed. She spoke maybe 5 words. But her hands told stories. She knew horses, not just how to ride them but how to touch them. There was a stallion he'd never been able to break, a red-eyed devil named Ash. Kicked every hand that tried to get close. One morning Boone came out to find Maybeth leaning against the fence, Ash standing still as prayer, her hand on his nose. He didn't ask how. He just nodded. That night, Boone sat by the fire and pulled out an old map his wife had drawn once. Lands he never got around to claiming. Maybeth came and stood behind him, quiet. "You ride?" he asked. She looked at him, then at the fire. Then nodded once. He pointed at the red hills drawn in ink. "That land there's worth running. Cattle need space. Fences won't hold much longer." She took the map, folded it slow, tucked it into her coat pocket. And just like that, the first promise passed between them, not in words but in purpose. A month later riders came, men with papers and badges and slick voices. Said Boone owed taxes for a deed he never filed. Said the ranch wasn't his no more. Boone didn't beg. Just stood still, jaw tight. Said they'd have to bring a judge if they wanted to take his soil. But men like that don't wait on judges. They just wait for weakness. Maybeth watched from the porch, arms crossed. One of them said something she didn't like, something about, "You and your giant girl." She stepped down slow. And Boone for the first time in years felt fear, not for himself but for them. because Maybeth had eyes like firewood that had never burned. And when she finally spoke, it was low, cracked from disuse and made of stone. "She's not for sale." The men laughed. But Boone didn't. Because he understood now she hadn't been bought. She'd been claimed by the land. And the land in its quiet way had given her to him. Not as property, but as proof that the ones the world throws away sometimes come back wearing spines. And sometimes they ride beside you, not behind. Boone didn't sleep much after that day. Men who come bearing inked papers and forged law always return, and this time he reckoned they'd bring more than signatures. He mended what he could. Reinforced the northern fence line with old timber. Sharpened his tools though he hoped not to use them. And every evening, he'd glance toward the bunkhouse and see the faint shadow of Maybeth standing near the lantern light, watching the dark like something might rise from it. She wasn't afraid. She never had been. But Boone could feel it in his bones. The wind had turned. And something old was circling. Maybeth didn't ask questions. But the silence between her and Boone had shifted. Not heavy anymore. Just full. Like two streams running beside each other. Still separate but never lost. One morning she brought him coffee in a tin cup, fingers wrapped around it like it held the world. He took it without a word. That was her way of saying she was ready. They saddled the black mare and the stubborn gelding named Flint. Rode east along the edge of the canyon, where the land still held scars from the last fire. Boone showed her the ridge he once promised to Clara, a place he never told anyone about. Maybeth didn't ask who Clara was. But she stood there a while as the wind lifted her coat and the sun pressed gold across the valley. Her shadow stretched far, taller than most men, unmoving. Then she knelt and pressed her palm to the earth. Boone turned away. Not to hide tears, but to give her a moment she hadn't asked for but had surely earned. They came back with a plan. Not to fight, not exactly. Just to hold. Like the last edge of a life worth keeping. The following week, riders appeared again. 3 this time. One carried a rifle too clean to belong to a man who'd worked. Another wore a gold watch ticking like it had somewhere better to be. They smiled like everything they said had already happened. "You were warned," the one with the rifle said. Boone didn't answer. He stood on the porch, arms folded, heart steady. Maybeth came from the barn, sleeves rolled, hair tied back like she'd done it in one motion. She didn't glare. She just looked. And something in them faltered. "She ain't legal to be here," the third man muttered. "She's not even documented." Boone took a step forward. "She's here," he said. "That's all the law I need." They gave warnings. He didn't move. Maybeth didn't blink. Finally they left. Not because they were afraid, not of fists or rifles. But because neither of them flinched. And men who take things by force don't know what to do with stillness. That night, Boone found an old locket beneath the floorboards. Inside was a sketch of his wife, drawn with pencil and time. He hadn't looked at it in years. He left it on the windowsill of the bunkhouse. Said nothing. The next morning it was gone. But in its place was a piece of braided horsehair. Woven into a loop. The kind used to bind trust between rider and steed. Boone didn't need to ask. Spring came hard. The river near the edge of the property flooded its banks. Chickens drowned. The barn soaked through. Maybeth worked through the night, hauling sacks and clearing ditches with a strength that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than muscle. Boone tried to stop her once. "You'll hurt yourself," he said. She looked at him then, for the first time, and spoke so low it sounded like wind breaking silence. "I've already been hurt." He didn't ask again. Later that week, a neighbor rode in from over the pass. Old man Truman barely holding his seat. "You heard what happened to Elmswood?" he asked. Boone shook his head. "Whole place cleared out. Ranchers bought up. Some girl disappeared from the trader's barn. Word is there's a bounty for her now. Price just went up." Boone didn't flinch. But his hands closed. "She hurt someone?" he asked. "They say she burned a man's face," Truman muttered. "Cut his reins, left him for wolves." Boone stared across the plains. "She didn't burn anyone," he said. "She just left." Truman didn't argue. Just tipped his hat and rode off. Boone stood there a while, hat in hand, heart burning. When he told Maybeth, she didn't speak. But that night, she climbed the ridgeline and didn't come down until morning. He watched her from the porch, her figure against the fire-colored dawn, still as a grave and twice as sacred. After that, they stopped pretending she'd leave. She belonged to the land now, to the horses that followed her like wind, to the fences she mended like wounds. To Boone, who began to understand that family was not always born. Sometimes, it rode in unexpected. Late in June the men returned. This time 5 of them. Rifles. Warrants. Words too sharp to be civilized. You're harboring stolen property, one said. Boone stood on the porch, arms at his side. Maybeth walked out and stood next to him. She was sold, another hissed. Not given. No, Boone replied. She was taken. And now she's home. The rifles raised. Maybeth didn't move. Boone stepped forward. One hand raised. She's not who you think she is, he said quietly. And then something strange happened. The horses broke free. From the rear pasture they came charging, not wild, not panicked. Come. Focused. They didn't trample or scream. They just surrounded the house, closing the circle like soldiers drawn to their general. And Maybeth stood among them, tall and still, her hand on the mane of the stallion called Ash, the one who'd never let anyone ride. The men backed away. Let him be, one finally whispered. And like shadows scattered by sunrise, they disappeared. Boone didn't ask how. Maybeth just turned and whispered something into the stallion's ear. And for the first time he bent his head in response. Later Boone would say he never believed in miracles. But he'd seen one that day. And not the kind with thunder or angels. The quiet kind. The kind that comes when a man makes peace with the ghost beside him, and a girl no one wanted finds a place that says, stay. But the real miracle hadn't happened yet. It would come when a truth long buried rose like smoke from an old flame. And it would change everything Boone thought he knew about the girl who rode beside him. Summer turned the land golden. The dust kicked up in low swirls across the fields where the cattle moved slow, steady, like they understood time in a way people never could. Maybeth took to riding the south line every morning before sunup, saddle light beneath her, stallion pacing with a grace no one had taught him, only remembered. Boone watched her most mornings now from the porch with a coffee gone cold. He no longer feared the men returning. He feared only that this would not last. Nothing good ever lasted in the West. It just borrowed time then rode off with it before you noticed it gone. Maybeth had changed. Her silence was no longer a wall, it was a choice. She moved with purpose. Her voice, though rare, no longer cracked. She said little, but when she did, it sat deep in the gut like scripture. Boone spoke more now, not because he wanted to fill the quiet, but because it finally had someone worth sharing it with. He told her about the war, how he'd gone too young, lost his brother in Missouri and his hearing in one ear during a river skirmish. Told her about Clara, how she'd fallen ill in '89, how she used to paint wildflowers on old feed sacks and hang them in the windows when winter got too gray. Maybeth didn't speak during those stories, but sometimes at night, Boone would see new flowers pressed into the seams of the bunkhouse door. She remembered everything. One night, thunder rolled low on the horizon, too far to break but near enough to promise. Maybeth didn't come in. Boone found her kneeling by the creek, hands buried in mud. Rain's not here yet, he said softly. She pulled something from the dirt. A box. What? Weathered. Metal hinges near rusted through. Boone stepped closer. She opened it slow. Inside was a bundle of letters, yellowed and sealed in wax with a mark Boone knew well, the initials JT in looping script. He sank down beside her. Josiah Turner, he muttered. My brother. The words dropped out of his mouth like a confession, like a ghost long tired of hiding. Maybeth held out one of the letters. Boone took it, hands trembling. They were dated. Each one. All written after Josiah had disappeared. Boone had always believed he'd gone outlaw. Run from a murder charge. The family never spoke of it again. But the letters told another story. How Josiah had left to protect a girl. How he'd witnessed a man in Elmswood trade children like cattle. How he tried to stop him and barely escaped with his life. How he'd taken one, a girl with large hands and fierce eyes, and hidden her. Raised her in silence, far from names, far from danger. She didn't speak, Boone, one letter read. But she listened. And when she looked at you, it was like you had to be better than you were. Boone read until his eyes blurred. Then he looked at Maybeth. You knew. She shook her head. Found them yesterday, she whispered. In the old root cellar. Beneath the floor. Boone stared at the girl beside him. Josiah's girl. His brother's daughter. The wild, wordless girl sold like freight had been blood all along. Not by his own hands, no. But by a world that forgot to care. He stood slowly as if the ground itself had changed. You ain't too wild, he said, voice breaking. Maybeth rose. I was never wild, she said. They just didn't understand stillness. Boone took off his hat, placed it over his heart. I'm sorry. She didn't ask what for. She just nodded. Later he would ride into town. Face the lawmen who'd threatened her. Show them the letters. Demand names. He'd find the traitor who first sold her and drag the truth into daylight, no matter how old or ugly it had grown. But not tonight. Tonight, he'd sit beside the creek while the clouds gathered. Maybeth would cook bread over a low fire, humming a tune she didn't know the words to. The ranch would sleep beneath the soft hush of coming rain. And the land, always watching, would hold them. In the weeks that followed, folks came by more often. Some said they'd heard about the girl who calmed horses by standing still. Others came for Boone's beef, which had grown strong and healthy since the fences were repaired. No one asked about the girl's past anymore. Not because they forgot, but because she had grown larger than it. Maybeth took to riding into the canyon most mornings. Boone knew better than to ask why. Maybe she was listening for Josiah. Maybe she just liked how the wind moved down the rock walls, like a voice too old to be human. One day she didn't come back until after dark. Boone was waiting on the porch. She dismounted, walked up the steps, and laid something at his feet. It was a badge. Rusted. Sheriff of Elmswood. Boone looked up at her. He gave it to me, she said. Said he was sorry. Boone didn't ask what she said back. Some things were best left to the dust. That winter was softer than most. Snow came late, melted early. Boone got sick once, fever, lungs tight. Maybeth stayed beside him for 3 days, spooned broth into his mouth, wiped sweat from his brow. When he came to, she was asleep in the chair by the fire, boots still on, arms folded. He watched her breathe and knew then what no paper or bloodline could tell him. She wasn't his niece. She was his redemption. The last good thing his brother had done. And the first good thing he would keep. Come spring, she saddled Ash and rode east with a map in her coat. She said she wanted to see the river her father had crossed. Boone didn't stop her. Just handed her a new canteen and the locket he once gave to Clara. Some things, he said, belong with those who still carry them. She rode out without a goodbye. But 2 weeks later he found wildflowers laid at the edge of Clara's grave, braided with horsehair. When Boone finally closed his eyes for good years later, the land was quiet. They buried him beneath the cedar tree where he'd first watched Maybeth brush down the mare. And beside that stone another grew. No date. No title. Just one word. Stillness. And those who passed by would stop and wonder who she'd been, the girl with fire in her bones and silence on her tongue. But those who truly knew that she wasn't tamed. She was returned. To the land. To herself. To the kind of family you don't inherit but earn. And some would whisper as they walked away, not all who are left behind are lost. Some are just waiting to be seen. And the prairie wind would carry their words away, back to the earth where stillness meant strength, and silence was love's oldest language.